Morning, everyone. I'm Anique, the distribution manager at Siegel EMEA, and I want to welcome all of you today to our last session of 7 BarTender 2021 EMEA Partner Technical Education. My colleague, Ian Cummings, who is the senior sales engineer of BarTender, will cover the following topics today: software activation and license hosting, license management, and license redundancy.
Now let's focus in on BarTender licensing. So this is all about software and printer licensing in BarTender, how best to manage it. So my name is Ian Cummings. I'm the senior sales engineer in EMEA, that's Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And let's get to it. So for the agenda today, as per usual, we'll first be going through a PowerPoint presentation of the different aspects of this subject, talking about the BarTender license, what it is, how it all fits together, etc. And activation, of course. License server management, so how you can manage the license and the printer licensing within the license server. Usage tracking, so you can track who has been using printer licenses and for what printers they've been used for. And we'll look at also the various redundancy options that the BarTender software now supports. Of course, once we've gone through the presentation, we go hands-on with the software, going through those different aspects in the software itself, basically going over what we covered from an academic point of view in the presentation. Of course, any questions afterwards, we'll be looking to answer as many as we can. So software licensing, in our view, it needs to be flexible, easy to manage. It needs to make sense to the customer. And most of all, we don't want it to get in the way of the customer doing what they need to do, which is to print production labels and other assorted documents, of course. So that is how we see licensing. When it comes to BarTender licensing, there are some different concepts to keep in mind. So we have the software license itself, so the BarTender license, and this will dictate, for example, the edition that the software is for. We also have the software license activation process. So the process, the steps we go through to activate the software using your product key code, the license code, and the various different ways that can be done. The BarTender clients and how they connect to the license server to get the licensing. So that's a topic in itself. And lastly, of course, the license server itself and its management, whether you're performing that management either locally or remote, printer licenses and user management, setting up and defining user access control for security, enabling the various failover and redundancy options in terms of licensing, and of course, alerts and notifications. When something goes wrong, how do we raise an alert, and how do we send that notification out to interested parties like an IT administrator? So let's first look at the BarTender license. What is a BarTender license and how is it activated? How is that activation managed? Let's take a look. Well, the BarTender license is represented by what we call a product key code. And this is used to activate the software, specifically in the license server section of the administration console. It consists of 4 sets of 4 characters, and you can see there in the slide the format in which that PKC takes, product key code. So it is this code that when you purchase a license is what is given to you from Siegel Scientific, typically these days by way of an email or through one of the websites. With BarTender 2021 and indeed 2019, the product key code, so to speak, is for life, meaning that the product key code itself is just a unique code, a unique value, which identifies a license. The state of that license can be changed via the BarTender activation server. The idea being that if you upgrade or change your license in any way, we simply change the state of that license for that product key code to reflect what the edition, version, number of printers that it supports should be, and its maintenance contract and all those sort of details. So it gives us very much great flexibility over what that product key code is actually representing. It should be noted in older versions of BarTender, the product key code encoded very much into itself the version of BarTender, the edition, and the number of printers that it was licensed for. And that's why in the past, if you then wanted to upgrade in any way, we had to deliver to you or to the customer an entirely new product key code. And that made things very complex and difficult to manage. The customer would result in having many product key codes, and they were then unsure as to which was the current product key code. With new BarTender since 2019, when they purchased their first license of BarTender, that product key code doesn't change even after upgrades. So there's only one product key code for them to manage, which is great. Types of license include, of course, the customer end user license. So this is a regular license that can be purchased. A partner license, so this is a not for resale license that are used by our partners, so you guys who are in attendance today. If you need a BarTender license for internal sales and support purposes, you would get in touch with one of our commercial salespeople, such as Anik, to request a partner license and giving us details of what edition, version, and number of printers that you need. And within reason, we will of course provide that for you for non-production usage, just as a sales and support tool. Also from the website, customers and users can obtain a trial license. So when they download the BarTender software to use as a trial, as a test to ensure the software meets their requirements, they will also be generated for them a trial code, a trial product key code, which is a 30-day code, temporary code, I guess you could say, temporary license that allows them to test the software for a period of 30 days as the enterprise edition, so they have full access to the software. It should be noted, particularly for you partners of ours in the audience, if you have a project with a particular customer where they need to run an extended proof of concept testing period, then again, get in contact with one of our commercial sales representatives and request a temporary license for a period of time for X number of printers that is sufficient for your customer to carry out their proof of concept. So if their proof of concept is particularly complex, needs to be of a certain scale, then we're very much willing to accommodate those requests so that a full proof of concept can be carried out. But those licenses will be issued upon request. And there's also this special item here, which is called a provisional license. So a provisional license, and we'll get into that a bit later, is actually an existing license. And it allows you to, with your existing license, to provisionally activate and use newer software. So this is for version upgrades. Now I'll talk about this in a short while on a separate slide, so I'll leave that hanging for now. BarTender editions and versions. An edition of BarTender simply indicates the number of features that are unlocked, that are available for use by the user in an unrestricted fashion. So the actual software that you download and install, so download from our website and install on your computer, is actually the same. There are no different software downloads depending on edition. Simply when you activate the software, depending on your product key code and what that product key code is, it will set the software for running as that particular edition. So if your product key code is for a starter edition, then when you activate the software, BarTender will run as that starter edition. Now, interestingly, it will still show all the functionality of the higher edition features, but if you use them, it will first warn you that you're using a feature that's not supported by your current edition. And if you then print, it will print a watermark on the resulting label. Now, when it comes to installing, the majority of components of the software are installed, with the exception mainly of two items. The first is the Print Portal web application, because of course not all users want to run a web server from maybe their desktop PC. And also the packaged SQL Server Express Edition, which we package with BarTender as a convenience to our users who wish to install the BarTender system database for logging purposes and for document management if they wish to use Librarian. It should be noted that both of these items are optional, so you don't have to have a web application and you don't need to use and install SQL Server Express for the system database. If you wish to ensure that neither of those are installed, then select the advanced option for the installation process and make sure those two items are deselected. Typically, the version that you purchase of the software will be the current version, although it is possible under certain circumstances to download and install older versions of the software, although that will only go back to 1 or 2 versions old. The version, of course, indicates a major release of BarTender in historical chronological time. So that's just when we launched or released the software, and of course the features that came with that particular version release. So it's important to differentiate between what a version is and what an addition is. Upgrades and software maintenance, because as we'll see with how we handle software activation, how we handle the license management, this is a very easy and seamless process. So of course, if the user wants to stay up to date with the version of the software, they can make sure they are keeping up with their software maintenance, that the software maintenance is current. So as we release new versions of the software, the customer can simply download from the Siegel Sales Portal and install the new version of the software. And because the license is covered by software maintenance, it will be allowed. The software will activate without any additional upgrades being needed to be done. Of course, if the customer initially purchased a lower edition, they can choose to purchase an edition upgrade if they want to gain access to some of the more powerful features. Simply all that needs to be done is to purchase the upgrade and either wait a day or two or manually force the reactivation or the activation update of the license. Essentially, from the license server, you can click a button or select an item that will ask the license server to reactivate or to update, forget the term we use, the license. And what it will do is contact the activation server the activation server on the internet, ask for the current state of what that license is, and of course, if the state has changed, such as an edition upgrade, but also as you see there with a printer add-on upgrade, it will simply change the state of the license that you have installed to match. So your edition will automatically be updated. Any additional printer licenses will be updated, and therefore your software will be running with the upgrades very much implemented. And in fact, by default, the license server will check in with the activation server on the internet every few days to see if there has been any change with that license. So even when you purchase an upgrade, it doesn't need any intervention by an IT administrator, because within a day or two, the upgrade would be applied in any case. So it makes for a very seamless process for upgrading the license with zero production downtime, which is great. Support number. Okay, so we're familiar with what the product key code is, which is the actual license that is purchased. But because a product key code has value, it's not something that we want to be presenting to users in general. And therefore, we have a support number, which is essentially an obfuscated version of what a product key code is. Basically, it's a reference code that cross-references to the product key code. So if you give the support number to a Siegel employee, they would be able to put that into some software, which allows us to cross-reference to what the actual license code is. So we at Siegel can see what that is, but everyone else cannot. Of course, the owner of the license, the person or the people who are managing the actual product key code, they will know what that code is, but everyone else in the organization will not. They will only know the support number. And we call it the support number because it can be used, of course, for getting technical support. Also can be used when requesting upgrades, purchasing upgrades, etc. You'll find the support number in the About dialog of BarTender Designer, as you see there in the screenshot. And also in License Server, each of the licenses are identified by the support number. I'll be taking a look at that too. So license activation, how do we activate the license? Well, when you first install and try to run the BarTender software, you'll be prompted to activate the software. And now, if this is the first PC within an organization to be activated, then typically the assumption is that this is to be the license server, so where the license itself will be hosted. The user will be presented with the dialog on screen as you see there, where they can type in the product key code. We actually have a handy paste button, so if you have the product key code in your clipboard, you can just click on that paste button to insert the characters into each of the boxes. Again, a nice convenience. Activation is an online process where the BarTender software is connecting to activation servers out on the internet. And activation can be accomplished either directly in the BarTender software. So you just put in the code, you press the next button, BarTender tries to connect to the activation servers on the internet and performs the activation process. Next screen you should see is activation successful or activation unsuccessful, depending on the situation. Now, of course, if the computer you're on does not have an internet connection, maybe it's an air-gapped PC on a production line or something like this, then you need to accomplish activation in a more indirect method. And with more recent versions or releases of BarTender, you can activate either via a mobile device using a QR code or by using the activation website. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. Of course, activation of the BarTender software license specifies the particular edition and version and the number of printer licenses that it is for. Initially, in the activation wizard, you put in your product key code. You are then prompted to select a license server. So it could be the case that you've installed BarTender just on the one PC, and therefore your license server will be your same PC, yourself essentially. But it could be the case that you've already installed BarTender on multiple PCs. Perhaps you've not activated them yet, but you would be activating on one of the PCs, and you can then select either your local PC or one of the computers out there on the network. If this is a BarTender client, so we're not actually wishing to do an online activation, but simply to connect your BarTender client to an existing license server that's already been activated, then you would choose to specify that license server to point that BarTender client to where the license server is located. However, if this is an internet online activation, but for whatever reason the internet connection fails, maybe you don't have an internet connection, you will get this error response where you can choose to activate by using a mobile device. It's meant to go one step at a time. So if no internet connection is found, you can activate via browser. So you'll be given an activation key, which you can either save to file, send as an email, or copy to the clipboard. And the activation key is basically a long hash code. So this is very randomized characters. I think there's about 500 or so characters in this hash code that represents the activation key. And what this key does is it identifies the license, and it also identifies the computer on which you're trying to activate the software, because it is these two inputs into our activation server that is then processed, and an output product activation code is then generated from. So basically, you'll take this long code, either save it to a file, send it as an email, or copy to clipboard, which you can then in some way take to some other computer device which has access to a web browser and the internet. You browse to a web page, you paste in the code, it will give you a big long code back, which you can then take back to this PC and paste in or select from file. So perhaps more of a laborious process, but unfortunately that's how it occurs if your computer does not have an internet connection. An alternative to this would make use of a mobile device. Essentially, that activation key is encoded into the QR code. So you would take your mobile device, you would scan the QR code, and it will take you to the activation website, where it will present you with the product activation code. And you'll be then able to fill in that activation code into the dialog there. So a slightly more convenient way than just using the browser activation. Now, we spoke about provisional license activation a bit earlier. Provisional licensing is allowing a customer to activate a new software version using their existing license so as to run concurrently with their in-place production. And this is to allow a smooth transition to the new software version in the production environment. Now, the principal reason why we introduced provisional licensing is because of a break in compatibility between BarTender 2016 and BarTender 2019. We'll come on to that in just a moment. Basically, during the installation process of the new software, so we are presuming a version upgrade, the user will be prompted to activate the BarTender software. And at that point, if they wish to do a provisional activation, they would enter in their existing license code. When doing so, they will be prompted if they wish to do a normal activation, which will make this new computer be the license server, or if they wish to choose a provisional activation option. So perhaps I should mention, with provisional activation, the idea is that you leave your existing license server intact and you install a new version of the software on a new different PC, and that you activate with the same product key code. We'll identify that it's the same product key code but on a different computer. So it will prompt you if you want to provisionally activate. At that point, you'll say, yes, provisional activation, please. And this essentially will activate that computer for a temporary period of time to run concurrently with your existing already activated BarTender license server of the previous version. If this is an enterprise edition, the provisional activation period is 180 days. If it is or any of the other editions, then you can activate provisionally for a period of 30 days. So why use provisional activation? Well, the main reason, as mentioned, is that from 2019 onwards, so between 2016 and 2019, we changed the communications protocol that was used by the BarTender Licensing service. So this is the communication connection between the license server and the BarTender client. So there was a break in compatibility. So one could not speak to the other. So if you wanted to perform a version upgrade, if you installed the license server first to be a new version of license server, then automatically your older BarTender clients would no longer be able to get printer licensing. And vice versa, if you updated a BarTender client, it couldn't get printer licensing from the old license server. So there's a bit of a catch-22 dilemma. Unless you can upgrade everything at once immediately, you are in a situation where users would not get or not be able to get printer-based licensing. So a provisional activation, you essentially have two license servers, the old existing license server and the new license server. This gives you time to gradually and gracefully upgrade and update your BarTender clients to the new version. You can perform testing, of course, as well to make sure everything is still working as expected. And it allows those new BarTender clients to still get their printer licensing from the provisional license server. Once everything is upgraded, testing is complete, all you need to do is decommission the old license server, and this will mean the provisional license server now becomes the active license server. If instead you let the provisional licensing period elapse or expire, then that provisional license server will deactivate and your existing in production license server will be the only license server in operation. So it's important to do your upgrades and your testing before that period runs out. Printer-based licensing. So we have the BarTender software license, which dictates the version that it supports, the edition, the number of features it supports, but also tied up with that is the number of printers, number of physical printers that the license covers. So in general, the customer should purchase a printer license to match the same number of print or physical printers to which they wish to print to a BarTender. So if your customer has, let's say, 100 physical printers, barcode printers that they wish to print to using BarTender, they should purchase a 100 printer license, no matter which edition of BarTender that you're looking at. There is an exception to that. We'll come on to that in the next slide. A used printer license that has not been used again by any BarTender client for an extended period of time will eventually be released. So when you use printer X, that printer X is not kept for the rest of time. Eventually, if you do not reuse that license, that printer license slot will be relinquished, will be let go. But it should be noted that we've tightened this up. So in the past, some customers may have been somewhat fast and loose or somewhat floating with the number of printer licenses that they have being a little bit less than the number of physical printers that they print to a bartender. Things have since tightened up. So really, although there is still flexibility, it should be the case that they should buy a license in accordance to the number of physical printers they have. On the flip side, there is no limit on the number of concurrent users or computers which are running BarTender, which has BarTender installed and is running, and on the physical sites where those BarTender users are located. So you can have as many BarTender users connecting to the license server, printing labels as you wish, performing whatever role, whether it's design and manual printing, or if it's an automated production server. It doesn't matter. They can have as many of those as they wish. It's just the printer licensing that is of importance and what is managed and controlled. So in this way, printer-based licensing gives the customer great flexibility as to how they deploy and use BarTender, which is good. Now, I mentioned an exception in terms of the printer licensing, and the exception is electronic documents. So in addition to print jobs being sent to physical printers, BarTender also supports producing print jobs to electronic documents, notably PDF. And indeed, with PDF, we support our own native PDF driver for rendering PDF files. And you can configure how the PDF is outputted in the format, if it needs to be locked with a password, etc. And also you can specify the variable name and path of where the PDF is outputted to. We still support third-party PDF drivers if customers still wish to use those. But any form of electronic document is also licensed. And we license this by the amount of items or labels that are produced by BarTender. So currently, we're rating it that every 2,000 items or labels that are produced by BarTender within a 7-day period uses one printer license. So of course, if you have 100 physical printers, but you're also printing or producing many PDF documents, then that customer will need more than a 100 printer license, because it very much depends on the scale of printing to electronic documents that they also wish to perform. A question in the chat. In the past, it was possible to delete printers from the license server. Could additional provisional activation solve customers' temporarily problem of using too many printers? Okay, so yes, in the very distant past with Seagull License Server, I think that's 10.1 BarTender and before, we did allow the deletion of printers in the Seagull License Server. That has since gone away. We no longer allow that because, of course, although it gave flexibility, was open to abuse, shall we say. So that is no longer allowed. I'm not sure of the question in terms of exceeding the license. We do have a grace period for that, and we'll be talking about that a bit later. So there are functions in BarTender that allow flexibility should you overshoot or overuse the number of printer licenses. And indeed, because purchasing printer add-on upgrades is so straightforward, simple, and easy to apply and implement, because this can all be done electronically. There's nothing physical that we need to ship. There's no additional product key codes that we need to send. Such upgrades can be applied very quickly. So even if the customer has an emergency, they can generate an emergency purchase order through our channel, and we can process that order as a priority to get them up and running with the additional printers. But as I say, there is a grace period, which we'll talk about a bit later. Now let's get into license management. So hosting and administrating the BarTender licenses. So first, there's the concept of license server and the BarTender client. The license server is the computer on the network that hosts the license, and you can configure and manage that license via the administration console. Whereas what we call a BarTender client is a BarTender software installation that connects to the license server for its licensing when it wishes to produce a print job. So the license server is hosting the license, whereas the BarTender client is performing print jobs and therefore requires to get a printer license from the licensing server. Only one computer can host the license at the same time, with the exception of redundancy, which we'll come back onto later, and thus acts as the license server. Though, of course, you can have as many BarTender clients as you wish that are connecting to that license server for printer licensing. The license server needs to be accessible to those BarTender clients, therefore, over the network. And that can be over a LAN-based network, a local area network, or a WAN, a wide area network. So for example, you could have a license server hosted and located at an international organization's head office, and each of its regional and remote offices are connected to that office, perhaps via VPN, to form an overall wide area network. BarTender clients operating at that remote site can get their printer licensing from that centralized license server. You could even host the license server in a private cloud out on the internet. Doesn't need to be on premise if you do not wish it to be. As of BarTender 2019 onwards, which is when we re-engineered and reconstituted our licensing server, we're using a fully encrypted TCP/IP connection, which by default uses port 5160. And this is what operates between the server and client. And this makes it very usable for not just internal networks, but also operating over the internet should you wish to use a private cloud. Another question, I see one was already answered by Anik. I'll take the next one. How would you apply to a customer who upgrades, replaces one or more of their physical printers? How would this apply to a customer? Okay, so let's say a customer has a 50 printer license and they replace some of those printers with new printers. Now, if it's a straight swap, so they have printer model X, and printer model X, a particular physical printer dies, breaks down, needs to be replaced, and the customer replaces it with the exact same model, then from the perspective of the BarTender software, it's still the same printer. So nothing has changed. If, on the other hand, you replace it with a different model, a different printer brand, or just a different model of the same brand, then of course the license server will see this as a different printer and therefore record it as an additional printer. Now, if you're already at the maximum of your printer license, then this will be seen as exceeding the printer license. And as we'll look at a bit later, we have a grace period for exceeding the printer license. So noted, but I'll wait until we get to that slide before I go into more detail about exceeding the printer license. So in terms of that communication architecture between the license server and the BarTender clients, it all operates through the BarTender Licensing service. So this is the Windows service that is installed on each BarTender installation. The licensing server is simply that computer, that BarTender installation that performed the online activation of the license and therefore is hosting the license. So the license is located at this particular BarTender computer. The BarTender licensing service, which is also installed and running on every other BarTender installation, is communicating with the licensing service on the license server computer. So it's, in this sense, a peer-to-peer architecture, except the only difference is one is operating under the role of the license server. So the BarTender licensing service, as mentioned, is installed on every BarTender installation. So it's there by default, running and operating and communicating with the license server, or if it's running as the license server, it's communicating with BarTender clients. So this is a Windows service which runs in the background. And of course, as with all Windows services, it will start up automatically as Windows starts up. And the purpose of the licensing service is to communicate between the BarTender client and the license server. So when the BarTender client wishes to print, it will request the use of a printer license from the license server. The license server will update its printer license state and either authorize or not authorize the printing in the BarTender client. Now, in standard operation, for the reasons of performance, when BarTender goes to print, it will actually print first, and then afterwards it will perform this printer license transaction. So it will say to the license server, okay, I printed to printer X, please record that in my printer usage for your license. So it's something that happens after the fact, because of course when printing, we want printing to be of high performance with as little delay as possible. Also, in order to minimize the amount of communication between BarTender clients and the licensing server, we actually batch up these requests in that BarTender client. So it's not each and every request. We'll batch up a number of requests together and then send that as a single update to the licensing server to update its usage statistics. So we're trying to minimize the amount of communication between the clients and license server, and we want to increase the performance by making this occur after the fact. Version compatibility. Now, we mentioned this in terms of provisional activation. So from 2019 onwards, we changed the network protocol that was used between the license server and BarTender client. Essentially, we moved to a fully encrypted TCP/IP connection, which is incompatible with the older versions, which used what's called UDP protocol, which is an internet networking protocol. So going forward, although we had that break in compatibility between 2016 and older and 2019 and newer, going forward from 2019 and following versions and releases of BarTender, you'll find that compatibility is once again retained. So, for example, if you're upgrading from 2019 to 2021, the license server and the BarTender clients are compatible. So there's less need for making use of provisional activation. It may still be the case that you may wish to use provisional activation for reasons of separating out the existing environment from your new upgrading environment, perhaps if you're going through a testing period. But mostly it's the case that provisional activation is of use for much older versions of software coming over to the newer versions of BarTender. Inside the license server, we can also specify user access control. So this is all about security, setting allow or deny permissions over who and from where people have access to licensing. And this user access control can be applied to the license servers itself, the licenses, so individual BarTender licenses, over users, and also over printers and printer groups and printer pools, which we'll be talking about shortly. It sets the security permissions over the various actions and components of the BarTender software, including the license management. As you can see there in the screenshot, you can set allow or deny permissions based on who that user is. So it could be everyone, a particular user, or a particular group. And it can be from where the request originates. It can be from everywhere, from a particular computer, or a particular domain, etc. And for the user access control, we're leveraging Windows Active Directory, so the users and groups of Windows. And this can be at the level of the organizational domain, but also of the local machine if you prefer. Printer groups. In the license server, you can define printer groups for the purpose of controlling which users have permission to use printers in terms of printer licensing for a physical printer. By default, there is a default printer group which all printers belong to unless configured otherwise. And there's also a blocked group. So if you wish to block a particular printer from getting a printer license, that can also be defined. So members of the blocked group can never be used as part of a BarTender print job. You can also create your own custom printer groups so that when combined with security, with the user access control, you can say this group of printers, only these users can get a printer license or gain access to a printer license for these printers. So if you're not part of that group that has been defined, the users for that printer group, you will not be able to print to those printers. So for example, you may want to define a production line printer group, so only the printers that are on your active production lines. But elsewhere in your organization, you have other printers, such as in the warehouse, at reception, or whatever the case may be. It may be that you don't want users who are not part of the production group to be able to print to production printers. And therefore, with printer groups, you can define these limitations. You can define this user access control so that unauthorized people can't print to printers that you don't want them to. Also, in a printer group, you can set a priority for the group. So it could be a high priority, medium, low priority. And this priority takes effect when we come to some of the redundancy options. And we'll look at this in some later slides. So when there's a contention for usage of printer licenses, that's when the priority kicks in. So for your production line, you'd probably want to set that to be high priorities. They are always high in the priority of which printer licenses those printers will have availability of. License setup. Now, in the license server, we can actually host one or more license. And you can access one of those licenses, and you can look at the details of that license. So here we can see in the screenshot, the license is identified by its support number, but you can give it a more meaningful name. So in the dialog there, I've set the name to be Production License 1 to help identify what that license is, rather than just a code. We can see the edition, the version it supports, the maximum number of printers it supports, when it was last used, what its peak printer usage was, and various other pieces of information such as when it was activated, when it will expire. Now, of course, if it's an end user customer license, it will not expire, but if it's a partner license or a temporary license, then yes, there will be an expiration date. The support expiration date refers to the software maintenance. So the user can check when their software maintenance is due to lapse. So you can see there that mine is due to lapse in November of this year at the end of the month. And lastly, we can see status is normal. And this means that everything is running okay with the license. I'm not exceeding my printer license usage, for example. If I was, that status would be reflected in the status information. You also notice that I can set license partitions and user access control for administering this particular license. In terms of license partitions, an individual BarTender license can be set or split into separate partitions, different segments, and it can be assigned to different groups of users through the use of printer pools, which we'll come on to in the next slide. So of course, an individual license could be just one partition, or you could break it up into multiple partitions. In fact, for example, we have a 20 printer license here. I could break this up into 20 partitions of one printer license if I so wanted to. Of course, that is not a recommendation, but you could do that if you want. And it is possible to modify the partition size or the size of a partition and apply that to your printer pool. So if you initially, as we have here for my warehouse and my production line, allocate 10 printers of my 20 printer license, I can do that at the beginning. But if I wish to change that later on, then I can just click on the edit icon and modify it. So maybe 8 for the warehouse and 12 for the production. So you can modify it as your business needs change. And also from here, we can keep a track of printer license usage. I'll show you that in just a moment. But first we'll look at printer pools. So printer pool is a collection of printer licenses that have been assigned from a BarTender license or partition. It specifies identifying information about the printer pool, and from this you can track its usage. And the source of the printer licenses, as I say, come from partitions or a BarTender license as a whole if you have not partitioned it. And thus, pooling printer licenses, you can pool printer licensing or printer licenses from more than one BarTender software license, although the software license has to be of the same edition and version. So maybe if we look at the screenshot here, for this printer pool called production, which is for my printers in the production lines, we're actually sourcing 10 printers from 2 separate licenses. Both of these licenses are for BarTender 2021, and they both happen to be enterprise editions. So they're matching licenses, but for the printer pool, I'm taking printer licenses from both. So this allows you in effect to join together your printer licenses into one big printer pool, one big chunk of printer licenses. So for example, it could be the case that a customer may have merged more than one business together, and each of those businesses or those business units each had their BarTender license, a separate BarTender license. With printer pools, you could assign each of those printer licenses or sets of printer licenses to the one pool, thereby in effect creating one mega license through which the BarTender clients can draw their printer licensing. And as before, we can specify user access control as to who has permission to access this printer pool for their licensing. So user access control is very much pervasive in the licensing server as to who has access to do what, whether it's from a management point of view or whether it's from using printer license perspective. Alerts and notifications. Of course, it can be the case that things happen, things can go wrong, things can break. And of course, when these events occur, we generate an application message, be that informational, a warning, or an error in terms of severity. These alerts can be logged to the system database for tracking purposes, but of course, if the event is particularly serious, we may wish to notify an admin person of the problem so that they can go ahead and start fixing the problem in a proper amount of time. So for this, we have email notifications. So you would click on the email setup button, enter in your details for your particular email system. And then for each of the events, as you see there in the screenshot, you would tick which of those events you'd want to send an email notification for. When it comes to printer licensing and license server in general, we have a technical document on printer-based licensing that gives you more details on the ins and outs of all this subject, and that's available from our support center website. So please feel free to download and take a read. Usage tracking. Also from the license server, of course, we want to track who and what printer licenses have been used for the management purposes. So as BarTender is used for generating print jobs, the license server is able to record this usage data, both in terms of users who are accessing the license and the printers that are being used and therefore consuming the printer licenses. It allows administrators at a glance to have a summarized view of who and how and what is being used. So they can keep an eye on things and take action should it be necessary. However, it should be noted that all of this tracking data of user and printer usage is stored as part of a license server's application state data. It is not recorded in the BarTender system database. So that the BarTender system database, it is not recording this information. It's part of the license server state data. So therefore, you can only view this information in the administration console under the license server section. So here we can see a screenshot of the administration console in the licensing section, and in particular, the printer usage item is selected. And from there, we can see the recently used printers. We can tick a checkbox if we want to quickly see any failed print requests that have been made. And beneath that, we can see a list of printers used in the last 7 days, the most recently used printers in the last 7 days. Now we can actually right-click on some of these items to perform an action, such as to block printer usage. So if a user sees the Microsoft Fax printer coming up in the list, for example, they can say, oops, don't want that to happen. They can right-click and choose to block the use of that printer. And in fact, that will add that printer to the blocked printer group. So in future, that printer will not be used again. And of course, as time goes forward, eventually that printer license usage will be dropped from the used printer list, thereby freeing a printer license slot. Now we can actually access printer usage details per printer pool. So if you, I'll show you this in the actual software. You click on a little icon, it will bring up printer usage details and statistics. I guess Zebra printers are popular with some of my colleagues. But as you can see, we can see details of the physical printers that were used. And you can sort those in various different ways. But also we can keep a track of electronic document usage as well. So here we can see in the past 7 days, 20,000 and more PDF labels or items were produced, and therefore that consumed a total of 11 printer licenses. So hopefully that gives you an indication of how that works. So for every 2,000 printed items created as a PDF or some other electronic document format, it will use 1 printer license. And that's why for this screenshot, we've used 11 printer licenses. That's some quick math I did there. We can also track user activity. So who has been connecting to the license server, from what computer, and what licenses, what BarTender license, if you're hosting more than 1 license, has been used. We can track that user activity ranging from now, so the current users who are currently connected and actively using BarTender, but also those users recorded in the last 24 hours, in the last 7 days, in the last 30 days, and also a summary of the most active users of all time. So that gives an admin a good observational view of user activity when it comes to BarTender licensing within their organization. Okay, so what happens if things go wrong? So redundancy and failover. It's all about improving the robustness of printer licensing. First, why license server redundancy is needed. Basically, we want automatic failover, and redundancy of licensing is important because we want to reduce or eliminate the risk of production line stops. So we want our customers to be able to continue producing stuff on their production line. We don't want their warehouse, where they're sending logistical items out, to be on stop simply because the barcode labeling system is not able to get printer licensing. And of course, the customers want to avoid the costs associated with such stoppages. If they can't print, this is going to cost them money, so we want to avoid that. To this effect, BarTender offers varying levels of redundancy. So we have grace periods, which we'll come on to in a second, and we also have backup and Triad license server redundancy, so redundancy on the license server itself. So the history of licensing redundancy. In BarTender 2016 and older, we had 72-hour grace period, which I'll explain in just a moment. We have exceeding the printer license grace period, and we had an alternate license server. This is where the customer would purchase an additional license, and in the BarTender client, you would specify your primary and secondary license server, so that should the primary not be contactable, the alternate license server would be used instead. In BarTender 2019, we retained the 72-hour grace period, we retained the exceeding your printer licensing, but we lost the ability to have an alternate license server. However, because we re-engineered license server, it was possible to host multiple license servers and to have them hosted from any of your BarTender clients. So it was possible to manually fail over your BarTender client to point to a different computer running a different license server. But that required manual intervention. And of course, we needed to have an automatic failover. So this is where in BarTender 2021, we have introduced our Triad and backup license servers for automated failover redundancy. Of course, the grace periods are retained as before. So what are those grace periods? Well, the 72-hour grace period, as mentioned, is for when a BarTender client cannot find or cannot connect to the license server. So when it's unable to do that to either the primary license server or any redundant license server, BarTender client will go into a grace period, and that grace period is for 72 hours. And that period begins from whenever the BarTender licensing service was last able to connect to the license server from the BarTender client. Now, if you remember, we're using service-oriented architecture for our licensing communication using the BarTender licensing service. So even if you don't have the BarTender client open and you're actively printing labels with BarTender, it doesn't matter because the BarTender licensing service continues to be running in the background, and every certain amount of time, that service on the client will ping, will check in, if you like, with the license server, with its licensing service, just to say, hi, I'm here, let me know the current state of the license server. And therefore, when that happens, that's resetting your 72-hour countdown clock. So it doesn't matter if the BarTender client was actively used before, that 72-hour clock will be more or less up to date, providing your BarTender client, of course, the computer was running. If your computer was not running, if it was cold, if it was not started, then of course the grace period will begin from when, will take into account from when that computer was last on. I hope that makes sense. So in ordinary use, the BarTender user will get 72 hours of grace period during which they can continue printing. Of course, it will generate an alert message saying, oops, can't find license server, into grace period, try to get the problem resolved before the grace period expires. And when that grace period does expire, of course, printing essentially stops, production printing stops. When connection to the license server is re-established, of course, that 72-hour countdown clock is reset. So providing those two services on the server and the client are able to talk, you have that 72-hour grace period up to date. I feel that might generate some questions. Another item which might generate some questions, exceeding your printer license. Essentially, when purchasing BarTender, you should purchase the number of licenses to match and cover the number of physical printers that you have, plus the amount of electronic documents that you may wish to print. Bearing in mind it's 2,000 items per week for one printer license. However, there is a grace period for temporarily exceeding your printer license. So when you exceed the maximum number of printers that you're allowed, you will go into a grace period of 30 days, by which time, by the end of that time, you would need to get your printer licensing back into compliance. So this gives the user some breathing space for handling temporary situations, such as bringing online new purchased physical printers, or if you're printing more than expected on the electronic documents, for example, it gives you some time, it gives you some breathing space to purchase a printer add-on upgrade, for example, if that is needed. It does have the effect, though, that when you are exceeding your printer license, that it changes the protocol that the BarTender client uses. So therefore, before it can go ahead and print, it will first check in with the license server to get authorization to see if it has permission to print to that particular printer. And we do this to make sure that you're not exceeding the grace amount of printers. And also if there is a contention, so if you're exceeding by more than the grace amount, or if you're exceeding beyond a period of time of the 30 days, then the printers that you can continue printing to, up to the limit of your maximum number of printers, is based on the priority of the printer groups and for those printers that you most recently printed to. And these are the printers that you can continue printing. So the idea being there, you can, in a predefined way, say that this group of printers are high priority, such as your production line printers. You always wish to be able to print to them. But also, the assumption is that the most recently used printers are those printers that you want to continue printing to as well. And it's the printers that perhaps you only printed to last month that are not the important ones, and therefore of low priority. But we of course also have license server redundancy. And so with BarTender 2021, we have redundancy on license server itself. The server itself can have redundancy that the BarTender clients connect to, and can be given redundancy through the use of a backup license server or a Triad group of license servers. In this way, should the primary license server fail, other license servers can respond to the BarTender client in its place. Now, of course, with license server redundancy, the BarTender client itself will still get a response from a license server. So the BarTender client does not go into a grace period, it doesn't go into the 72-hour grace period, because it gets a response from a license server. License server redundancy also requires the enterprise edition of BarTender currently. Who knows, maybe that will change, but currently that's the enterprise edition. And there are two redundancy options for the license server. Each have their advantages and disadvantages, and depending on the customer's situation will depend on which is the better choice to take. So first, backup redundancy. The idea of backup redundancy is kind of like with the old Siegel license server. You have a primary and alternate license server. So you have the main primary license server, and now we call it the backup license server. So if the bartender client is unable to find the primary, it will automatically fail over to the backup license server. In the administrations console under the redundancy option, you would set up your license server redundancy, and essentially you're mapping your primary license on one license server, mapping that to a backup license typically located on a different license server, so a different bartender computer. And that establishes the relationship so that when the bartender client goes to connect, it automatically understands that it can fail over to the backup license instead. Now you can run this in an active or passive role. And what we mean by this is that you could split your bartender clients in half and point 50% or half of your bartender clients to one of the license servers to use that as the primary, and the other 50% could point to the other license server and use that as the primary license server. It therefore kind of load balances the use of printer licensing between those two license servers. In the scenario where the go away VPN, in the scenario where one of the license servers goes down, then of course half of your users would switch over to the other license server, which is being used as a backup license server. Of course, this requires two distinct licenses. So the customer would need to purchase two bartender licenses, one for the primary and one for the backup. The other option is what we call Triad redundancy. Now, by contrast, this only uses one bartender license. So you don't need to purchase any additional licenses. But it needs to run on 3 separate computers. So 3 computers all hosting the same license and therefore acting as a license server for however many bartender clients. But you would run them as a triad, so as a group of license servers. The concept here is that you'd have automatic redundancy and failover so that if any one of these nodes goes down, you still have trusted licensing, therefore an active license server still running through the 2 remaining license server nodes of the triad. So you at the very least, you need 2 of those nodes to be running in order for license server to still respond to your bartender clients. So it allows for a failure of one server. So it gives you somewhat more robustness of your license server. Now, between the two, in terms of advantages and disadvantages, well, of course, with the backup license server, you need to purchase an additional license, so that has extra cost involved. But the backup license is perhaps more robust over wider area networks. So for example, if you have your main license located at the head office, and you have a remote site elsewhere in the country or elsewhere in the world, then if, for example, your internet connection goes down and you're no longer able to connect to the head office at all, let alone the centralized primary license server, then it will fail over to the backup license server, which could be located at that remote office. Whereas with Triad redundancy, because there needs to be active communication between each node of the Triad, of course, if you're relying on a wide area network for each node of those of the Triad, for each license server of the Triad to be in communication, it's susceptible to failure should that network go down. So if you're at a remote site where you just have one of your license servers of the Triad located, if your internet goes down, then automatically you lose connection to the primary and secondary license server in this case, leaving just the tertiary, or at least one of the nodes available. That would be a fail state. You need two of these license servers to still be connected and contactable. So a triad redundancy in that situation would not be helpful. So in that situation, you would be better served with a backup license redundancy option. Whereas if you're operating just in a local area network and you have sufficient computer resources available to you, then triad redundancy makes a lot of sense, because a local area network is much more reliable. And of course, if your local network goes down, then you probably have more problems than just printer licensing. And of course, triad redundancy, it's supported just with one license. So there's no additional cost. So when setting up your redundancy, you can click on a button to start a wizard, and it will step you through the process of creating either a backup relationship or the triad relationship. So you would step through the process according to what you want. So here we have screenshots of the wizard where you create the backup relationship. You select your main, your primary license server, and then you select your backup license server, selecting a license for each. So you map a license on your primary server and you map across the backup license server that you want to fail over to. And that will result in a successful backup relationship being created. And you'll see the backup server license is established. So you can see where the primary is located and where the backup license server is located. Alternatively, with the triad relationship, you would enter a name for your triad, your group of license servers. You would select the servers from the available list to form your triad. And when you create the triad, you essentially have to reactivate, to re-authenticate the activation, so you're activating them as a triad, as a collective group. So you need to make sure you're connectable to the internet. And then each of the nodes of the triad, you can assign roles as to whether they are the primary, secondary, or tertiary servers. And at the end, you have the summary of what has been created. Triad relationship established, and you can see the current status of that triad. Of course, if those arrows are all green, that means everything is in working order. If there's a failure with one of the nodes, then that would be indicated with, I think, a red arrow or something. So it will show you the current state of your Triad. And of course, you can make changes to your Triad by clicking there on the menu button to make changes as you need to. And in this slide, we can see a failure state, so what that would look like. As we can see here, the secondary node is lost, but licensing is still in place through the primary and tertiary nodes of the Triad. Of course, this is a complex topic, so we have a white paper, a technical document on license server redundancy that you can get from our website. I see a question on how do we move a license from one non-network connected device to the next. Well, when we go hands-on, I'll see if I can run through that. And I'm about to go hands-on any second. So currently in BarTender software, we only support printer-based licensing via a software license, be it for physical printers or printed items for electronic documents. We do recognize, however, this does come up, that there are other licensing paradigms out there. Should you be working on a project where a standard licensing model is not working for yourselves, then please do get in contact with your regional sales manager to discuss possibilities that we can work from the commercial side to better fit within the requirements of a particular customer. The software still works the same, it's still printer-based licensing, but from the commercial angle, there are approaches we can take that better fit in with the requirements of a customer. Let's take a look and go hands-on with the software. Here we see the administration console. And in the administration console, I have selected the licensing section. From here, we can see and access the various licensing functions. Currently, in the main licensing section, we can see all the licenses that are hosted on this computer. So this computer is iCummings LT2, which is my laptop, but also I can see that I'm connected to other license servers elsewhere on my network. So this one is in our Madrid office, this one is in the US, and this one is in Taipei, in our Asian office. So as you can see, I have access not just to licenses on my computer, but also licenses on other computers. Whether I can actually do anything with these licenses depends on the user access control that I have over them. And I'll show you that in just a moment. If we're looking at individual licenses, we can see the various columns gives us information about the license itself, and that's the support number, as you can see, the edition, the latest version it supports. So if you have software maintenance, you could have different software installed that is not of the latest version that the license supports. So I could still be running BarTender 2019 software, for example, but the license I'm using, because it has software maintenance, it would allow me to upgrade to 2021, and it will tell me there if I needed to see. It shows me the number of printers that license covers, the computer on which the license is hosted, when I activated the license if and when the license expires. So of course, this is a partner license, so it expires, what, 87 days from now. If it's an end user license, then it's a perpetual license and therefore does not have an expiry date. And you'll notice also support expires, and this refers to the software maintenance. So if your customer is unsure as to when their software maintenance runs out, they can open the administration console and they can see in the administration console exactly when the software maintenance is to expire. And this information, all of this information is coming from the online activation service. You'll notice there's an icon here. We can refresh our license. And what that does is it means the software will reach out to the activation server out on the internet and ask for the current state of what this license should be. And therefore, if you upgrade your license to add printers, an addition or version upgrade, that upgrade will automatically be reflected. So if you added more printers, simply forcing the refresh, bang, immediately you'll see more printers being listed for the particular license. As noted earlier, this refresh does happen every 2 or 3 days. So if you're not in any immediate hurry for the license to be updated, it will update in any case without any further user intervention. So it's a very hands-off process. But you can force it if you're in a hurry. If I right-click on the option here, well, we can see that we can choose to activate a new license. I can deactivate the license. I can move the license, refresh the license, which is the same as clicking the button here, or reactivate the license, or switch to this license. Obviously, this is my current license, but if I wanted to switch to this license instead, and therefore my BarTender client would be connecting and using this particular license, then I can select that option here. In fact, if I were to first look at BarTender, go help about, I can see the edition I'm currently using and the support number, or i.e. the license that I'm currently connected to. We'll see that it ends 96HY, which of course corresponds to my current license. However, if I choose to switch to this license instead, come back to BarTender, help about, we can see that I'm now running the automation edition and I'm connected to a different license entirely. Now, of course, for most customers, typically they will only have the one license, but there may be some customers with more than one license. And of course, yourselves as partners, you may also be hosting more than one license, be it a partner license or a full license within your organization. From here, we can activate a new license, which will start the activation wizard. So for example, I can put in a whole bunch of PKC values like so. Now, because it's a unique code, we're not going to do any validation on what we enter there. The only validation occurs when we go online to the activation server to do the activation process. But before we do that, it will say, do I want to activate this license that I just entered, the product key code I just entered, on any particular server that I have administration role over? And you can see that I can administer my local laptop, or the server based here in Madrid, so the one in my office, essentially. But I don't have administration capability over the server in the US or in Taiwan. And this is because it's locked down with the user access control. I could also specify a licensed server that I wish to connect to. So if it's not already listed, I can enter in the details of some other licensed server instead that maybe is not already added. Then I hit next, and it will attempt. And of course, the product key code is invalid because it doesn't exist on the server. And from here, I could try, it's failed over, and I can show you how I can activate using a mobile device. So this is where you would scan the QR code there, generates an activation code which you can then paste back in. Of course, that won't work because it's a bogus code, or I can activate via a website. So I can take that activation key, which is a long text file. So if I copy to clipboard, I can show you what this looks like. Type in Notepad and paste it. There you can see the long hash code that is generated between two inputs of the product key code that you inputted and the ID of the computer on which you're trying to activate the software. Those two inputs, you put that into the activation website. So I click on the link there. So I paste the code in here. I choose, specify that I'm not a robot. I'm not going to click through the pictures. Generate a product key code, or a product activation code, should I say, which will only work if I'm putting in a valid product key code, of course. And from that, it will give me another long code, which I would copy and paste back into this. So if you're doing this between computers, you would save it to a file, use a USB stick to transport that text file across to the other PC, which you can then select from the file requester here. A bit more of a laborious process, but it allows you to get the job done. You'll notice that one of the licenses here has a failed state. It's got this red mark as opposed to green, which means everything's running normally. The reason for this one is because it was a trial license, and that trial license for free printers has since expired as of October 2020, so a long time ago now. So if there is a problem with any of your licenses, look out for either a yellow or red dot. A yellow dot would indicate there's a warning, some problem, maybe it's in a grace period or something is about to expire. Red means that it's just not working whatsoever. Beneath our list of licenses, we see our list of license servers. Now, of course, my current license server is, well, actually, let me just switch back to my enterprise license before I forget. Okay, so my current license server, of course, is my own laptop PC. So that's my computer name, my IP address, and the default port, which is 5160, on which the service is running. And in total, I'm hosting 7 different BarTender licenses. You'll notice that these other servers, they're running 5, 14, and 5 printers respectively. If I wanted to, I can add an additional license server So I'd enter in the host name or IP address of another license server out there on my network. And if that license server is hosting any licenses, it would also be listed there. If that license server is not yet hosting any licenses, because it's just a standard BarTender installation, then it will list the number of licenses it's hosting as 0. And we could choose to hide those license servers if we wish, if they're not hosting anything. The reason why you may want to see a license server that's hosting 0 licenses could be because you want to move your license from your current server to that other server. And notice you need to have administration rights over that server in order to move from or away from to or away from your current license server, if that makes sense. The advantage of using the move option is that it does not affect any of your significant activations. In the past, when you wanted to move the license, you needed to deactivate the license and then reactivate on the new PC. Now, if you use the move option, because the 2 license servers are actively on the network and can communicate with each other, we can move the license in a trusted fashion, and that move process is a seamless operation, thereby allowing you to perform the action with 0 production downtime. Now, I think the question was asked, well, what if one or both of the servers are unable to speak to each other? Well, in that case, you would need to use the deactivation method. So you deactivate the license on the current license server and then reactivate the license on the new license server. That will use a significant activation. Sorry about that. If there's good reason for that, and of course, when you contact technical support, they can increase the number of significant activations if necessary. But as you saw with the activation process, that activation process can't be performed when the server is not connected to the network or the internet. So that is how you would manage that process. Hopefully that answered that earlier question. Now, it could be the case that, okay, I'm running on port 5160, but I want to run it on a different port instead. Well, yes, this is possible. Just right-click on your license server and choose to restart on a new port. So you change the port number to be a different number, like 5161, for example, and choose restart, and that will stop the BarTender licensing service and restart it on that different port that is specified. So that will result in the licensing service going offline for that short period of time. So you'd want to do that in a maintenance window when BarTender clients are not trying to print. Now, of course, those BarTender clients, if they're not able to contact that license server, they could fail over to a redundant license server if one has been set up. Or it could be the case that it will simply go into the 72-hour grace period. So production printing will still continue. In terms of user access control, here at the bottom, this license server, we can specify access. And by default, you grant access, I think it's to the local administrator. So on my PC, I think I changed that at some point to specify me in particular as having administration access to my licensing server. And what this means is that it either allows or denies access to performing these management tasks in the licensing server. Because of course you can see that, yes, I can manage my local licenses on my local license server, but equally I can manage licenses on other computers as well. So I can do remote administration. So I can choose to deactivate or move licenses or whatever the case may be on licenses that are hosted on other computers, so long as I have server access and that has been defined. So here I'm allowing my specific username from this computer to have access. And actually this user access control dialog, this rule, is the same for each of these user access options elsewhere in the licensing server. So I can choose a user or group name, is or is not, and of course, one of the items from the Active Directory or local machine list. And in terms of from, it can be anywhere from this specific computer, or I can specify a particular host, a DNS domain, a Windows domain, or IP address. So we can be quite flexible as to from where the user is coming from. So for example, if you want to allow or restrict access based on the domain of the organization, so for us it would be siegelsscientific.com, then you can do so. That would prevent any outside users from outside your organization from being able to access these features. And of course, you can add additional rules as you wish. So it's not just the one user access control rule, you can specify multiple. Okay, let's take a look at, well, we'll step ahead and go to license setup. Now with license setup, we can look at our individual licenses as hosted on each of the license servers, and also the printer pools. So first, the licenses. If I click on my license server, I can see each of the licenses that I'm hosting. So we have the enterprise license. So if I click on this, we can see that its name is by default coming from the support number. And I can call this my production license 1, for example, just to give it a more human, more meaningful name. We can see the details of that license, status, the various dates, etc. And I can see that there's just the one partition. I can also specify user access control, so who has access of the users that are allowed to use this particular license. So it's not the access to the license server, it's access to the license in this case. So it's a user access control at the license level. And for that, I permit anyone currently, because I'm nice. You'll notice here that for the license, there's a little icon here. If I click on that, I can view the printer usage details. So for this particular license, recently, I've not been very busy. Only one printer has been used, producing 5 different printer jobs. If instead I took one of the servers, for example, let's look at this server here. And one of these, do I not have permission on it? Because it probably hasn't been used, that's why. So if I look at the usage of this particular license, I guess there's a few more uses of the license that have been made use of over the past period of time. You'll notice also that it includes the creation of electronic documents. So if you want to keep a track of the amount of electronic documents that have been generated, you would do so in that way. But let's look at my particular license here. So if I look at license partitions, I can see just the one partition. It's not associated to a printer pool just yet. And I suppose what I need to do is create a printer pool first, but we'll come back to that. But what I can do is say, let's take 10 printers from this particular license to create a partition, and another one here to take the remaining 10. Let's just type it in, like so. Okay, so we now have 10 each. Let's create a printer pool. So we already have some there already, but let's pretend they don't exist. Because what I'm going to do is create a printer pool for production department. And perhaps it's easier to create your printer pools first before trying to create partitions, because you would need a printer pool in order to assign your partition to it. So I create a production printer pool and a warehouse. Department. Right, so I have 2 printer pools that are for 2 different parts of my organization. Now, of course, I need to assign some partitions to that, or some licenses to that, so it actually has some printer licenses there. So if I switch back to my licenses and go to my partitions, for this particular one, I'll assign it to the production department. Thank you. And for this one, I'll assign it to the warehouse. So with one license, I've assigned it to 2 separate printer groups, 2 printer pools, should I say. I can also have this other enterprise license. Now notice that it's the same version and the same edition of BarTender. And for this partition, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign that, let's say, to my production department. So I'm still going to have just the one partition, but I'll assign it to the production printer pool, like so. So now when I look at the printer pools, the warehouse has 10 printers, while the production department actually has 20 printers. So from this, you can see that we can actually have multiple partitions or licenses being assigned to our printer pools. You can then, of course, say who has access to that pool of printer licenses, and therefore, when printing, they have access to however many printers that they need to print to, if that makes sense. So it allows you to, by department or by physical location, you can limit users to only using the number of printer licenses that they are allocated for their particular business requirements. So it stops, let's say, the users from the warehouse overusing their allocation of printer licenses. And if they overuse their allocation of printer licenses, then of course that can be at the detriment of other users from other departments and can cause contention or conflict over, fighting over who has access to what printer licenses. So it gives you more nuanced control over who can do what and who has access to what, who is allocated what in terms of printer licenses. And of course, you can track this activity under user activity. So of course, on my PC, it's only me doing stuff. So currently, it's only me connected to my license. And in the past 24 hours, well, it was the weekend, so I wasn't doing anything. After the last 7 days, it was just the integration service running on my computer that was performing printing. And over a longer period of time, it was me as a user, plus the integration service and automated service that was performing printing. And of course, we can look at who is the greatest of all time, who is the GOAT in terms of printing. And yes, it is me. Excellent. But perhaps for more interesting information, let's go to the European server. Who is the GOAT in Europe? In terms of printed items, I can sort by printed items, and the GOAT is colleague Raquel. You win the trophy. So it allows an admin to keep a track of what's going on within their organization, who's doing the printing, who that user is, where they're located, how many printers they've been printing to, how many print jobs and printed items are they printing to. So they can see who's been performing activity within their organization in terms of printing and printer licensing. This leads us to printer usage, where we may wish to see not just the activity, so a recent activity, whether that's on my PC here at the bottom or in the European server in this occasion. I can see recent activity for printers by various users on that server. So we can see a lot of electronic documents have been generated. If I want to, I can show only the failed requests. So where a user has tried to print to a printer, either where they haven't any permission, or perhaps the printer is blocked or something else. And that would allow the admin to quickly see if any of those attempts were. Anyhow, if there is a failure in request, perhaps if you're exceeding the license and you're trying to use that one printer too far, then that request would be denied, and therefore it would show when you tick this checkbox. We can also set permissions. So if we go to the permissions of printer usage, this is where we have printer groups. By default, as I mentioned, all printers as you use them are added to the default printer group. So as you're printing, by default, they're added to the default group, which has a medium priority. And as with everything else, you can specify user access control as to who has permission to print to these individual printers. So it's not at the license server level, it's not at the license level, it's at the printer level that you're defining this user access control. The priority is important in terms of when the license is in a contentious state, meaning, for example, that you're exceeding your printer license. Those printers in printer groups of higher priority will be the ones that will be the printers that are prioritized for continuing to be given permission for printing. Whereas those groups or those printers in a low priority group, those are the ones that are more expendable. So that if you're still exceeding your license, if the printer you're trying to print to is in a low priority group, then chances are you'll be denied access to printing to that printer. You'll be denied a printer license. After priority, it's then based on when you last printed to a printer. So if you recently printed to a printer, then that printer will be more likely to be given authorization. Whereas if you printed to a printer many months ago, from a long time ago, then that is more likely to be denied should you be in a contentious license state, such as exceeding your license. So we have a default group, which by default all printers are added to. And we have a blocked group. So here's my other HP LaserJet, which I guess, as you saw, if that printer is in your blocked group, you simply don't, or maybe I don't have it installed anymore. Either way, if you try to print to that printer, you will be denied access a printer license. Let's just see if I still have that printer actually installed. I guess I do have it installed, so maybe it doesn't remove. So the printer is installed, and therefore, if it is in a blocked group, it appears to be the case that you won't see it as being a driver or a printer to use within the BarTender software. So as you can see, there's no HP underscore LaserJet that I can select. I think that's a new option that we changed. Okay. So we have a default and blocked group that we can add your own custom groups if you wish. So I call this one production printers. And for example, I could set this as being high priority because I always want my production printers for my production lines to always be available. So therefore, when we're in a contentious situation, it's those printers that I want to be prioritized. Now, what I can do is I can add members manually by putting in the details like so. Alternatively, I can come to my default group, select my printer, and edit the selected printer to move it to the group that I wish it to belong to. So now my barcode printer A is now part of my production printer group. Instead of adding these printers manually, like I've done, we can specify a mapping rule. So by default, you can see there is a default mapping rule where we say any printer model at any location of any port would be assigned to the default group. And indeed, that's the behavior we see. Whereas if we create a new rule, let's say for production printers, I can say all printer models or all printers of location such and such, if the printer model is, let's say, barcode printer, something like this, or I can say matches barcode printer. So for example, I can use a regular expression such as from the beginning, if it says barcode dot anything like so. So what this means is if the model of my printer begins barcode and ends with anything else, then automatically add that to my production printers list. Okay, that won't work in the real world because I don't have any printer models called barcode. I have printer instances called barcode, but not printer models. Then it would automatically move those printers as they're used to the production printers group, which therefore sets their priority and therefore allows me to specify which users have access to those printers. So permissions is all about printer permissions and printer priorities. An activity, we can see the activity of those printers. Switching over to alert setup. You can see because I don't have any spare computers available to me. I'm based at home at the present time. But in the alert setup, we can see all the various different messages that can be generated in the licensing server. Of course, we can log that to the system database. But if you want notifications, we can go to email setup. And of course, I've entered in my email credentials. So we're using Outlook Office 365. I can test that to make sure the credentials are all correct. Test email sent successfully. And then I can choose which of these messages that I want to generate a notification from. So you would go through the list and see which are the particularly important events that you wish to keep a track of, and therefore a notification email will be sent in due course, notifying an admin of any potential issues that they need to deal with. Lastly, on redundancy, as I say, I can't show you, so I don't have access to additional license servers to hand, but essentially you would click on the button there to start the wizard, choosing between the relationship types that you wish to use. You'd step through the process and select your service. You'll notice it's got a caution mark there because I don't have the necessary permissions over those other servers, or the servers aren't in a state that permits them to be joining, in this case, a Triad redundancy group. But essentially, you'd use this wizard to specify your redundancy options. And with that, I think I've covered most aspects. Let's look at the questions. I do see one question there about would different ports on one physical printer, for example, USB and Ethernet, use two different printer licenses? And you said the answer is yes. Just want to add some information to that. So if we look at the printer usage, with printer usage, you'll notice that we keep track of the printer model, the location, and the port. And it's these three items in particular that allow us to uniquely identify a physical printer instance. The printer name is not important because the printer name can be changeable. That's not an issue. It's the model, because that is not changeable. The printer is what it is. The location, i.e. the computer on which the printer driver instance is installed, and the port on that computer. Now, of course, if the port is changing between a USB port and an Ethernet port, as in the question, then essentially there's no way we can see that those are not two different printers. So we will see them as two printer licenses. So when setting up your printers, you need to make your choice as to how that printer will be connected, and ideally to stick with it and to have it be the case that it's consistent. So for example, if you share that printer to other users, that they access that share in the same consistent way as the user accesses that printer on the same PC. So ideally, if you do have a printer on a USB port and you are sharing it, you do have to be careful in order to avoid what we call duplicate printer licenses being used. Because if we see that as a different port, i.e. a USB port and a shared network port, then we will see those as two separate printers. We are trying our best to improve matters so that we are not duplicating printer licenses for what is in fact the same physical printer, but there are some limitations there.
For attending. Thank you, Ian. Stay safe, stay healthy, keep on selling BarTender. We wish you all a great summer. Goodbye to you all.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.